Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program hosted by the Asian Pacific American Women Lawyers Alliance and AAPI on More Than Meets the Eye, How Gender and Sex Intersect with Racialized Violence Against Asian Americans. My name is Esther Rowe, and I co-chair APALA's Civic Engagement Committee. On behalf of APALA, I would like to thank our partner in today's event, AAPI, who has always provided important support in putting on this program. I also would like to thank our many co-sponsors. APALA is very appreciative of your solidarity in supporting today's program. APALA's Civic Engagement Committee works to examine and take action on issues that impact AAPI communities and women, ranging from policies like affirmative action to day-to-day experiences like microaggressions, and to advocate for structural and interpersonal changes that promote racial and gender equity. Today's panel came together in collaboration with conversations we had with Karen Wong, our moderator today, following the murders of 8 people, including 6 Asian American women in Atlanta. We understood that the violence that was inflicted in Atlanta was not an aberration and not just the horrific acts of one bad actor. Rather, it was a result and reflection of the ongoing effects of a long history of intertwined racism and misogyny experienced by AAPI communities. Today's program examines the recent hate crimes against AAPIs with this lens. The tragedy in Atlanta occurred on March 16, 2021. That was 10 weeks ago. Sustained media attention is important to keep the issues in the minds of mainstream society, but we also believe it is up to each of us to keep the inquiry going so we can understand for ourselves what has happened and why it has happened, and to advocate for change not only during times of extreme crisis, but also once the sense of an immediate threat has died down. In doing so, we recognize that anti-Asian racism occurs even when it doesn't make the news, and that it will take a collective effort, perseverance, and imagination to envision and effectuate a world in which we dislodge the long shadow of harmful stereotypes and tropes and replace it with structures and narratives that promote fairness and equity. I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator today, Karen Wong. Karen serves as the Executive Director of the David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy at UCLA Law School. Prior to joining UCLA, Karen advocated for civil rights and immigrant rights for more than 20 years. She was the longtime Vice President of Programs and Communications at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles. She has written and interviewed with media such as the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times on issues affecting Asian American, immigrant, and LGBTQ communities. Karen has published articles in numerous law journals at Berkeley Law, UCLA Law School, and New York University Law School. Thank you to all of our panelists today and Karen for moderating today's panel. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much to Esther and to Paula and to all of you for joining us. And I am absolutely delighted to be here today with 3 speakers who I consider personal sheroes of mine for their fierce work on race and gender justice issues. I'm going to briefly introduce them, but acknowledge upfront that I cannot do justice in a few minutes to each of them. So what we're going to do is drop links to their longer bios into the chat so you can check those out. First, of the 3 speakers, first one I will introduce is Jen Fang. Jen is an Asian American feminist and activist. She runs and writes for the blog Reappropriate. She also often comments on race and gender issues for other media outlets, and her writing has also been published in places like the Washington Post and Teen Vogue. And if you don't follow Jen on Twitter or via her blog already, Reappropriate offers some of the most incisive analysis on everything from affirmative action to media representation, from activism and arts to politics. So welcome and thank you for joining us, Jen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next is Renee Tajima-Pena, who is a documentary filmmaker and professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. She directs the Center for Ethno-Communications there. Among her many other accomplishments, she helped to found or worked at groundbreaking Asian American media organizations like Asian Cinevision and Center for Asian American Media. And she directed the Academy Award nominated film, Who Killed Vincent Chin, among many other documentaries on issues of immigration, race, ethnicity, and gender. Most recently, she produced Asian Americans, which is a 5-hour PBS documentary series that I absolutely urge you to watch or watch again if you've seen it. It's currently streaming on PBS and Amazon Prime, or support the independent filmmakers behind it by buying the DVD. But it's a great series you should see. And then last but not least, we have Helen Zia. Helen is an activist, writer, and former journalist. She has written many, many articles and essays and books, including, probably most relevant today, the book Asian American Dreams, which was published in the year 2000, but is still highly relevant today in its examination of diverse Asian Americans as an evolving political voice and identity. Helen has perhaps the most diverse resume of anyone on this panel today. She started out in medical school, but found herself called to community activism and organizing, including time spent as an auto worker in Detroit, and eventually turned to journalism and writing, which included serving as executive editor of Ms. Magazine. Most relevant today, she was also one of the key community organizers in Detroit in the aftermath of Vincent Chin's murder, which we'll talk about in a second. So, as Esther mentioned, today's panel came together in the days following the horrific shooting of 6 Asian American women in Atlanta, perhaps the most extreme targeted killing of Asian American women in modern US history. The murders in Atlanta coincided with the day that the community group Stop AAPI Hate released a report showing that from March 2020 to 2021, the enormous spike in anti-Asian hate incidents over the past year was borne disproportionately by Asian American women, roughly 2/3 of all reported incidents. Although AAPI is the host today, and it's an organization of women lawyers, our goal today is not to duplicate the many conversations that have been held in the past 2 months about anti-Asian hate crimes more generally. Our partner Kalapaba, for example, has hosted a whole series, which we can drop links into for those who want to explore other aspects. But today our hope is really to focus more specifically on how racialized violence against Asian Americans often intersects with and is complicated by issues of gender, sex, and sexuality, and how understanding these intersections can inform our response to the current wave of anti-Asian violence. So with that, I thought we should start with some historical perspective. So since Asians first arrived in the US, we have been greeted with violence, from the Chinatown lynchings in the late 1800s to Islamophobic vigilantism post-September 11th. This violence tends to ebb and flow in relation to how Asia and Asians are positioned relative to white America. For East Asians, the last notable spike was in the 1980s and 90s during the rise of Asian economic power. The murder of Vincent Chin is perhaps the best known case from this era. And if you don't know Vincent Chin, here is the sort of one-sentence summary. Vincent was a Chinese American who was beaten to death by 2 white auto workers in Detroit, which was the heart of the US auto industry. And it happened at a time when Japanese auto manufacturing was rapidly eclipsing US companies like Ford and GM. So I'm going to turn to Helen and then Renee. You were both, and we're so fortunate to have you here because you were both instrumental to lifting up the story of Vincent's death and the subsequent fight for justice. And his death and the movement that followed has come up a lot in the past few months. And so I wanted to start there. So first, Helen, I'm going to turn to you. You were one of the key organizers seeking justice for Vincent back after he was murdered. And can you tell us a little bit more? I know we don't have as much time as you need to give full justice to the story, but can you tell us about how the racialized violence against Asians was actually viewed at the time of Vincent's death and the legacy and impact of Vincent Chin's case on what was then a relatively new concept of hate crimes? Talk to us about where the community was and sort of what's happened as a result of that case.
Sure. Yeah, but this, what happened in the 1980s and the Vincent Chin case has uncanny parallels to what's happening today. And I would like to just add one thing to, the one sentence summary that, of background to give on that. It wasn't just, or even that, Japanese industry was overtaking the US, it was that there was a crisis, an economic crisis in America at that time caused by an oil embargo, an oil crisis in the Middle East. But it was that Japan was blamed for the collapse of the auto industry because Detroit dinosaur cars got about 7 miles or 8 miles a gallon, and Japan made fuel efficient cars. And the one notable thing about that is Germany also made very fuel efficient cars that were being bought, but racism only works. Racism, targeting, and scapegoating only works when people look different. So Japan ended up being blamed and targeted very much in the way that China today has been singled out as the cause of every problem today in America. And anybody who, well, not just anybody who looks Chinese, not just East Asians, but we know that there was a mass killing in Indianapolis that was targeting our brown Asian brothers and sisters. So what happened in Detroit in 1982 that led to the killing of Vincent Chin was also is also very parallel to what's happening today, except that the enemy that was to be destroyed back then was Japan, and anybody who reminded other people inclined to hate and violence was a target. And today that's true for anybody who reminds someone of a Chinese enemy. And so we're in a time like that today, but I think I want to kind of bring us to, for those who might not be familiar or might not have been born around the 39 years ago when Vincent Chin was killed, there were not a lot of Asian American attorneys, men or women, in the US, all right? And not only that, in the state of Michigan, when Vincent Chin was killed and his two white killers were let off scot-free because they were not the kind of men you sent to jail. They were white in a city like Detroit. And there was no questioning about, well, in the climate of intense anti-Asian hate, an Asian American gets killed in an incredibly violent attack, and no investigation was done by the police at all to find out what might have caused that, whether there was any race or racism involved at all. And we see that, that happened, just a couple months ago in Atlanta. The very first comment from the police was, oh, this has nothing to do with race. It had nothing to do with misogyny, though he didn't say that. That is, I think where we're going to go with this discussion. But in any case, back then, the community had to scramble. We were not a pan-Asian community. There was not an AAPI, Asian Pacific American legal anything in the whole country. There were really only two advocacy groups on behalf of Asian Americans then, the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco and ALDEF in New York. And neither of them really did criminal cases. This was a murder that took place. And so when the community, first of all, had to come together, and it was a time when one of the first meetings we had, we got almost all of the Asian American attorneys in the state of Michigan into the room with us, with the community folks and Vincent Chin's mother, to talk about what the options were when a judge sentences two killers to probation. And what can we do to challenge the judge's sentence there? And we had 10, less than 10 attorneys in the room. None of them did criminal law. And so we were scrambling. If you can also imagine, there was no internet. We didn't even have fax machines then. I know it was like dinosaur years. But so how do we start connecting? Well, it was all about community. Who did we know? Whose phone numbers did we have? Contacting ALDEF in New York, contacting Asian Law Caucus, contacting the communities where there were attorneys, and trying to delve into what options we had. And the first thing was, let's go talk to the judge. Can we convince the judge to vacate his sentence and to review that? Well, I'm sure that hasn't changed today. Judges and their egos, you're not going to get them to admit that they made a mistake. Then it was also getting the community together to talk about race. And so that's a question today too, right? When we're out, in the community, on the street, talking to, how do we get the community together to stand up for civil rights? Now, 40 years ago, that was something our disparate Asian ethnic communities had not done. I did not have the experience of coming together as a Pan-Asian group. And so we actually had to have meetings to talk about, well, if we're going to bring up civil rights and ask for a civil rights investigation, do we have to talk about race? That was actually a question the organizers had to talk about over and over again and really explain to get the community representatives of the Department of Justice to come and meet with our, meetings of 300 people to go over what is it that we can do. Because at that point, the local police had done no investigation. There was not any information that we had about whether this could have been racially motivated. All we had was the fact that we knew we could have been targeted because that was going on every day. And so we had to have those discussions with ourselves and then extend it to the larger legal community. At the time, when we started talking about whether this could be a civil rights investigation and lead to civil rights charges, we had almost every liberal attorney standing against us. The Michigan ACLU said there's no way that Asian Americans that the Department of Justice should consider an investigation for Asian Americans. Why? Because Asian Americans weren't around when these 1860s laws were promulgated, which clearly was wrong. And it just, was a reflection of the complete and total ignorance that even still exists today about Asian Americans and Asian American history and life. But so that was one of the arguments from the Michigan ACLU. The Michigan National Lawyers Guild said the same thing. And not only that, linked it to minimum mandatory sentencing, saying that, well, if Asian Americans, and who are you people anyway, but if you pursue a civil rights case, that might be double jeopardy. And aren't we then looking at adding penalties to people who have been rightly or wrongly acquitted? And so today, there are arguments I'm hearing about minimum mandatory sentencing again to say, well, should we, support hate crimes protections laws? So those were some of the things we had to do to actually begin to have a voice for Asian Americans as members of this democracy, that we should be protected by federal law in the same way as anyone else. So there's a lot to say about this. I'm just going to try to quickly say that the Vincent Chin case in the community standing up and raising our voices really reflected a broadening of the view of who should be protected by federal law and federal civil rights law. And I'm referring to federal civil rights law because at the time there were no hate crimes laws. The concept of hate crime ordinances was just beginning then. And the Asian American community in fighting for Vincent Chin's, for justice for Vincent Chin, really was part of that movement. So the fact that the federal government did step in and did say, yes, he is Asian, but we will take up this case was a real, not just a victory for our community, but it was a broadening of the view of who should be protected, what, protected classes. Vincent was an immigrant. Should immigrants be protected by federal civil rights law? And I don't think there's anybody, even today in the climate that we're in, examining, the role of the criminal justice system who would say that, well, we should exclude immigrants. We should exclude Asian Americans or Latinx people because they, quote, weren't around when those laws were created in the 1860s. So that was one big hurdle. And the fact that we were able to accomplish that really, when, I don't know that I've seen a good analysis of how hate crimes protection laws have evolved, but part of the opening up of the idea that Asian Americans, immigrants, LGBTQ people, gender, disability, all of those things are now included under the hate crimes protection law that was passed under the Obama administration. Several states include those things, and it is called the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Hate Crimes Protection Law, right? And so, I am very proud that our Asian American community was really at the forefront of broadening a view of who in America should be protected by the laws that we have. And the other thing I'd like to just add too was that, Vincent Chin's family, the community, his mother, didn't have a chance to show up in court when the two killers were sentenced to probation. And instead, what the judge heard, and there was no prosecutor present either, by the way. So nobody was there to speak on behalf of the victim. And so the Vincent Chin case also became a part of advocating for victims' rights, advocating for victim impact statements. And in Michigan, after that whole debacle of showing that, there wasn't even a prosecutor present. And so the defense lawyers were able to say things like, well, actually, it was the victim's fault that this whole thing happened. And really, how do we know that the 4 baseball bat blows to his head had anything to do with his death? He fell on the ground. He could have died from hitting the pavement. And that's the kind of thing that was presented to the judge. And so the Vincent Chin case became the sort of the harbinger of victim impact statements. And in Michigan, that was called the Vincent Chin rule. So that with the Me Too movement and, the documentary that's come out about the gymnastics doctor who molested and harmed so many girls, when they stood up one by one in the hundreds and said, "You harmed me," and making those victim impact statements in Michigan, they were exercising the Vincent Chin rule. And that was another contribution of the Vincent Chin case. So all of these things came into play, the model minority, racist myth, all of those things. And that's why this case really encompasses so many of the issues that we're looking at today. So that's, I tried to make that short, but
Thank you, Helen. I know. There's so much more you could say. And thank you so much for me, and I don't know about the others here. I've known this case for years. It's actually the case that drew me to law school to begin with. And we're going to get to Renee in a minute. It was actually the documentary that she did on the case that was part of that. But it's been really eye-opening to me to kind of learn some of these other legacies of the case that I think have actually not been as well known, and to understand both the impact on the Asian American community in terms of the organizing and the Pan-Asian kind of identity that developed, as well as sort of the impact on kind of criminal justice processes. So I want to stay on this case and actually turn with a question to Renee now. So you made the documentary Who Killed Vincent Chin, and it examined the circumstances surrounding and also the aftermath, I think, of Vincent's brutal death. And I thought, actually, you had amazing access to Vincent's family and friends. Mostly, I think it's his mom was his only family member, but his friends, activists like Helen who were in it, but also witnesses and even the killers themselves who never denied that they had committed this act. They just didn't think it was such a big deal what they did, right? Shortly after the Atlanta shootings, you shared some really fascinating insights to me about how you thought sex, and specifically sexual stereotypes of Asian American men, may have played a supporting role in the death of Vincent Chin. And I invite you to kind of expand on that more, kind of from your lens as somebody who had this broader view of what was going on in the case. Oh, Renee, we can't hear you.
I'm a filmmaker and I didn't have the sound on. Sorry about that. So, and it's interesting what Helen was saying about, federal civil rights protections, and hopefully later we'll get to this question of today, what hate crime protections and enhanced penalties means in terms of solutions and, the conversation around that. But in terms of, so I remember, talking to everybody, including Ron Ebens and Mike Nitz and, their side and their lawyers, and then the Helen and people with ACJ and the lawyers and Lily and Chin's friends and family, and just look, and also reading the transcripts. I read like everything from, there wasn't much in the state case, but of course the federal case there was quite a bit of testimony. We interviewed a lot of the witnesses, and it struck me that despite it, people keep on calling Ron Evans a unemployed auto worker. He was not. He was a foreman. Had a really good job at Chrysler. He was a foreman. He had a family. He had no criminal record. And so why would somebody have so much rage that he, from the parking lot of the Fancy Pants where they had a fight, he hunted Vincent down for almost, I think, up to 45 minutes. That's a long time to cool off. He had so much rage, and he took a baseball bat out of his trunk in front of witnesses and beat his skull in. And so the evidence that the federal case rested on of this environment of the recession, the anger towards Japanese imports, that he mistook Vincent for Japanese. And, I think that was definitely a part of the environment. But what turned that, like, the yellow light to a green light? And I thought that, in just being Asian American, I'm just speculating, but here they were when they were in the Fancy Pants, what the witnesses, the dancers, told me is that, Vincent was like, had this banter going, he was giving them money, and he was kind of, he was just being a regular guy. And so there was some kind of argument in the club. And then when they took it out and there was a fight, that Vincent was, he had played football in high school. He was a gregarious kind of guy. He was not your stereotypical Asian male. And Ron and Mike were really big guys. Ron was like, maybe 6'2", 200 pounds. And apparently Vincent was kicking their ass, both of them. And so to me, I can imagine, and this is what, a kind of a hate crime or this federal case rests on. Everybody knew who killed Vincent Chin, but what was going on in the head of the killer, in terms of race and in terms of motive. And so I can just imagine that, Ron was getting his ass beat by this Asian guy, and he's thinking, this MF, and having these presumptions of Asian men as being effeminate, weak, turning the other cheek. I think I can see that rage as being the signal that turns the yellow light to a green light, in addition to, Asians being dehumanized, demonized, seen as the enemy, seen as the other. But it's that, when you have that personal interaction between two people. And so I think that when the Atlanta case, I think it was very similar in, you just have to look at these deep-seated presumptions and these cultural images and the way people understand who an Asian American is, and how that affects their personal actions. So you had, like, the day after the Atlanta shootings, you had the Cherokee County sheriff who says Aaron Long had a bad day and a sex addiction, and he's told me it had nothing to do with race. Okay. And so Asian American women, Asian Americans period, including everybody on this panel, called BS, because they went back, to the Page Act of 1875, which targeted Chinese immigrant women because they were seen as being prostitutes. They were seen as, carriers of disease. The American Medical Association issued a statement that, the Chinese were immune from certain diseases, but that these women would infect white men and those white men would die. So they were seen as the other, who could never assimilate. And those kinds of perceptions of Asian women as being hypersexual, the walking virus, the other, the expendable, has, had these long legs in the American psyche up to the very present. So maybe, and usually in a hate crimes case, you would have to have like evidence like a swastika or something like that, or somebody said something verbally. But I think what's as important are these kinds of these psychological or these cultural understandings of who's in front of you, who you're about to shoot, whose skull you're about to bash in with a baseball bat. And so it goes beyond some of the and again, I think the environment, you can't deny that this environment, because data shows that after the Atlanta shootings happened a year to the day exactly after Donald Trump first tweeted Chinese virus. He did that March 16th, 2020. The shootings were March 16th, 2021. And certainly, that rhetoric in the White House and the GOP that we were the walking virus, we're causing all this calamity and death, that triggered a lot of this upsurge. So, I think that environment, like the auto recession and the deep kind of economic pain Americans were feeling, I think that was, a part of the motivation, but also, this kind of looking at these women as being, these hypersexual, like they're his kind of, they were the evil ones drawing him in to this kind of life and into his addiction, as being dispensable, as being expendable. I think that it's bigger than what can be litigated. Maybe, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what the hell could be litigated, but it just seems to me that it's you have to look at all the different layers.
Yeah, no, thank you, Renee, for that. And as somebody who teaches in a law school and was a lawyer, or still a lawyer, I guess, I do think the legal system doesn't fully address a lot of these issues. Like you said, it really misses some of the bigger picture sometimes that is so critical. So, I appreciate you sharing kind of, sort of your thoughts about, some of what might have been going on in the Chin case, which some of this is like, I think because there's been so much additional unpacking of the Chin case almost 40 years later because of what happened in Atlanta. Both the things that Helen has shared and now you've shared, Renee, I think are new even to someone like me who has spent a lot of time trying to understand and understand the case and understand what happened to Vincent. So that kind of element about, an Asian American male who doesn't meet the stereotypes of, they're expected of an Asian American man, particularly from a white Midwest, auto worker, sort of is an interesting idea. Now, I want to move to Jen, whose work focuses, explicitly on gender and race. I just wanted to ask Helen if she had anything she wanted to say briefly, on the Chin case, since you were there. I don't know if that issue came up at all. If you have anything you want to add briefly.
Sure. Yeah. To what Renee was saying, those were all issues that came up in the community discussions. The question of, Vincent was there for his bachelor party. He was getting all of the attention. He was spending money. And there wasn't any doubt in us as the community on the ground that there was some sexual jealousy involved. We talked about the masculinity issues that might have been there, but also as activists, we knew that would just put this even more in the margin as Asian Americans. We were already, a tiny fraction of the community, and nobody even, the people we dealt with didn't even know, like, who are you Asians? What are you complaining about? Where did you come from? Those were the kind of questions we were answering. So, we did not get into, more of the intersectionality questions because people couldn't even, grok the idea that we were Asian Americans. So, but yes, if we delve into these, other layers, they're definitely there, and good questions to ask because they're very relevant to today.
Thank you, Helen. And that's so interesting that that was there. And I think it speaks to the inability of the legal system to deal with intersections, right? That you had to kind of, you saw it, but you kind of brushed it aside. And I think that's a good segue over to Jen, because, you know, I want, Renee already started to get into this, but, you know, we've touched now on the idea of kind of one of the major tropes around, you know, Asian American sexual stereotype, which is the desexualized Asian male. But the other common trope is that hypersexual Asian female that Renee talked about, and the accompanying fetishization of Asian women that goes with it, and both of which reared its ugly head, as Renee pointed out, in Atlanta. And so, Jen, I mean, a few days after the Atlanta shootings, you had a great piece in the Washington Post titled "Asian American Violence is Often Inseparable from Misogyny." And I think it would be great if you can unpack that for us. I mean, in a few minutes time, but kind of, you know, tell us, you know, why are racism and sexism so intertwined for Asian American women? Maybe like the, you know, 5 to 7 minute version.
Right, the very, very short version of that question. I really appreciate that question. And when we want to think about Asian American racism, I think we often think about racism in general, whether it affects Asian Americans or other people of color, in this very degendered, agendered kind of way. But if we think about what racism, how racism has created the stereotype of the Asian, or the image of the Asian in sort of the Western mindset, what we find is that gender is inextricable now, but it was inextricable from the onset of when the West first met the East. And so if you look back to the earliest contacts between the Western world and parts of Asia, and you find what people were saying when they came back from trips to Asia on trade, you find that the way that they described Asia was also very gendered. Right in those earliest contacts, you know, the land was described as very feminine, in very feminine terms, and very beautiful, sort of like virginal lands kind of thing. The men were described as very weak, very effeminate, very submissive, and very non-masculine in the terms that they were described in. And the women were described as very hypersexualized, very hyper-aggressive, very exotically sexualized. And a lot of this stuff was covered in Gary Okahiro's essay, When and Where I Enter. But when we look at the way that the West was then basically building and constructing the image of Asia for itself in its own imagination, that initial image was gendered. And the reason for that, we can come to understand, is that the West is creating its own sort of, in its own imagination, a rationale for how it's going to position itself, how it's going to situate itself against Asia, and given itself a rationale for its own dominance over Asia. And so those are being communicated for itself in gender terms of the Western world, this like implicitly masculine Western world, in relationship to Asia as a feminine land that needs to be conquered sexually, in relationship to women that need to be conquered and made submissive and conquered sexually, in relationship to the men who are so weak that there's a certain sort of like inevitability of this very masculinized Western world exerting its own military or cultural or political control over this new Asian land. So this is like centuries before even the formation of America. The way that Asia is developing itself in the Western imagination is gendered. And then you fast forward to the creation of America. We talk a lot about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, but we don't really talk about the Page Act, as Renee brought up. Nearly 10 years or more than 10 years before the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the Page Act was passed. As Renee sort of mentioned, it was the first restrictive federal immigration law, and it targeted Chinese immigrants who were coming sort of for the last couple of decades at that point, as cheap labor. But as women were starting to come to America, there became this sort of moral panic around the Chinese women, many of whom were brought as prostitutes, but not all of them were. But there was this moral panic about now what was the effect of Chinese women as being perceived as hypersexualized, connecting back to those earlier images of Chinese women as hypersexualized and sexually aggressive and morally suspicious. how can, now there was this panic over how they might be corrupting the puritanical white American man. And so the Page Act is passed to try to stop and exclude any immigrant that's deemed undesirable. But the Act's own authors noted that part of the effect of it was to effectively remove the impact or the influence of Chinese women as prostitutes on American men and their purity, and to sort of excise out this corruption or this contamination, this moral corruption or contamination that Chinese women were perceived to bring to America. And so even with some of the earliest restrictive immigration law, racism is inextricably tied to a sexist stereotype of Asian American, Chinese American women at the time. And the Page Act effectively eliminates virtually all Chinese women's immigration into America more than nearly 10 years before the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and yet we rarely talk about that. And then if you fast forward again, Asian American women are continue to play this role of being constructed as sexually promiscuous, sexually aggressive, this sexually corrupting influence. And if you look at the ways in which the wars in Vietnam were constructed, again, in the American imagination, again, it's constructed through this lens of the Southeast Asian American woman as prostitute. If you look at, for example, the image of Full Metal Jacket, the film that popularized the phrase "love me long time" or "love you long time," that was again about portraying Asian American women as prostitutes to either be conquered by the Western man, the American man, or to be feared for her potential corrupting influence. And we see those tropes continue to play over and over and over again. And ultimately, the way that we can think about it is that racism is never separated from gender. The way that we experience racism as Asian American men, as Asian American women, that's inextricably tied to the ways that we experience sexism and sexist stereotypes. And so if we look again at Atlanta, we see the same echoes of the Page Act in the stated motivations of the Atlanta shooter. He was talking about feeling as if he was going to be corrupted by sex workers. And so he goes and he targets Asian American women under the presumption that they're sex workers, despite currently there's very little evidence that they did work in sex work. But he was acting basically from the same motivation as what prompted the Page Act in the first place, a fear of the Asian American woman as a sexually corrupting force and the need to protect sexual purity of American men through violence. And then I also just wanted to quickly mention, this is all happening in the context of a year or more of rising hate crimes. And as you mentioned at the outset, Karen, many of those hate crimes and hate incidents being experienced by the Asian American community are being experienced by Asian American women. Roughly 2/3 of self-reported hate incidents are being reported by Asian American women. And so we can think about the ways in which the stereotypes, the racist stereotypes that Asian Americans experience, both as men and as women, how the influence of gender is coloring, pardon my pun, the ways that we're experiencing that racism, whether we're being seen as potentially more vulnerable as victims because of the ways in which Asian American men might be perceived through these longstanding stereotypes as being more physically weak, more disengaged, less aggressive, or whether Asian American women are experiencing different forms of hate incidents, in part because we're experiencing the intersection of racism and sexism and these sexual stereotypes.
Wow, thank you, Jen. I'm always so impressed with all your knowledge, including the legal knowledge as a non-legal scholar. So thank you for walking us through that history. I also wanted to ask, because I pitched a question to you first, but both Helen and Renee, I know, have a lot of your work has been at the intersection of race and gender, or race and sexual orientation, in your speaking, your writing, your media projects. So I just wanted to invite both of you, to share any thoughts you might have, around this question about how sexual stereotypes about Asian Americans, the harm they've caused, and quite honestly, like what they've done to maintain a narrative of white supremacy that lessens our humanity, and I think helps to lay the groundwork for the kind of violence that we've been seeing. So I don't know, maybe Helen, start with you, and then Renee, if either of you want to add to this this conversation. Helen, you, I think, are muted.
They keep unmuting us.
I think Jen covered very well the sexualization and racialization and the relationship there, and this whole point about the intersections is intersections. Really, we're talking about the margins. We're talking about Asian Americans are already as a racialized group, and viewed as a monolithic group that is in the margins already. And then if we start talking about gender, sexual orientation, poverty, or any of those things that add to the layers of being marginalized, it really renders an already invisible group invisibilized. And we see that over and over again. And the way American culture and intellectual culture is, emphasizes categorizing people, right? And we know that we're talking to an audience of lawyers. So law is structured. These are property crimes. These are people crimes. These are sex crimes. And what do we do with people who are, overlap? And so, we're human beings. So all of us are complex, creatures, and we have multiple areas of identity, intersectional identities. And so the idea that any human being would just fit into one place. But what happens when you're an Asian American woman or an Asian American queer person? And, we get into the issues of violence, for example. And I don't want to go into, well, I guess I'm going to go into things, but some of the examples I give, I might be triggering kind of things. But this was a question that came up when we organizers, the women organizers who are involved in the anti-Asian violence movement and trying to stand up for that. And so because there was no internet then, we would have to rely on anecdotal reports that would come out in the news about racist attacks on Asian Americans. And there were many, many, many following, the Vincent Chin case, not related, but part of that same time of economic crisis. And so there were a lot of cases for us to look at. And the ones that, me and other activists that we would clip out and look at them, after a while, you say, wow, I've got like 50 cases here and they're all men. Why is that? And so actually a small group of Asian American feminist activists who were, by then I was in the Bay Area, and the Asian Women's Shelter group started meeting about this to talk about why is it, is it that Asian men are more in situations where they encounter people who are prone to racist violence? Is that the case? And that Asian American women don't get affected by haters and, So once we started looking, it didn't take long before we started finding names, and we started finding patterns of actually a summary of some of the essays, and the examples that we found are in this book, Making More Waves. It's an anthology there, but it was very clear. There was an Asian American woman, 27 years old, 25 years old, in New York City, who was pushed in front of a subway train. She was pregnant and decapitated by a man who said that he feared Asians. So he didn't hate Asians, he feared Asians. This was, of course, not a hate crime, right? There was a Japanese American woman in Oregon who was shot through her kitchen window and killed. And, they never found a perpetrator, but coincidentally, it happened on December 7th. And, if you actually look at some of these crimes that happen to Asian Americans, 4th of July, December 7th are days to kind of be aware. We know that there were incidents involving college, young women in college who were subject to sexual assault by fraternities who had a frat, you want to call it game, called ethnic sex challenge to have a list of different kinds of women that they would have sex with. And, you know, a few women reported gang rapes by these kind of perpetrators, college students. And these were not viewed as race related at all, even though their game was called Ethnic Sex Challenge. And a very, very heartbreaking case involving, an 8-year-old girl who was found sexually assaulted, dead, hanging in a tree in North Carolina. And this was shortly after one of those, sort of soft porn magazines came out with a feature story featuring Asian American women portrayed in various positions of bondage as though they were dead, including a picture of an Asian woman hanging from a tree. And this incident happened, within a month or so after that. And all of these things, and there were others, just added up to saying that, you know what, Asian American women, because of the sexualization that both Renee and Jen were talking about, just sort of, okay, then is it a sex crime? Is it and then of course we know that women in general are marginalized in the criminal justice system. And so they're sort of shunted there. And what about the race of the women? And we can go into LGBTQ targeted people too. Some people might remember the name Jeffrey Dahmer, the serial killer who sought young men, and the 14-year-old Lao refugee kid who was a target of him, Konarak Synthosyphone. And again, is this a sex crime, or is it a race crime? And what happens is that nobody answers that. And one of the biggest problems with hate crimes laws is that the people on the ground, the police and the DAs, are the ones who decide. And just like we saw in Atlanta, here's the sheriff who says, oh, it has nothing to do with race. Well, what, first of all, do many of these cops know about racism, right? And then we find out that, oh, yes, and he's contributed to Make America White Again. And, so there is the question of bias right on the ground in declaring, the people who decide whether they get investigated or not. So there are just who falls through the cracks. And so that is, Asian American women and other women of color or other people on the margins fall through the cracks. And this is the kind of thing that, as we look at how do we change, structurally change what we call the criminal justice system or the criminal injustice system, to really address protecting people. And then, the people who are most in the intersections and the margins, we can just look at what's happened to Asian American women.
Thanks, Helen, for unpacking that. You and I actually traded some emails about this in planning for this, but it was really striking to me after Atlanta that I first was thinking about this issue because of a conversation I had with you in law school, which was many years ago, because I was researching the issue of violence against women and how Asian American women both fell through the cracks in terms of domestic violence advocacy, which is very white-centered and still is heavily that way, not so exclusively anymore. But also the hate violence work, which actually has been so center to much of Asian American civil rights mobilization in the last 4 decades. And, you had framed it as, Asian women being missing from this national conversation. And, I remember, spending, as law students do, spending weeks and months kind of writing, a paper that no one's ever read since then, on it. But what was, really depressing to me was, some 25 more years later with Atlanta, seeing that those same issues were still playing out, right? Like, was the community, was law enforcement going to embrace an intersectional crime where there was both elements of sex and gender as well as race implicated? Was it going to be lifted up as a case of hate violence? And it was interesting to me after, our conversation all those many years ago that, in the years subsequent, I've seen that the cases the Asian American community has lifted up in terms of our hate crimes mobilization, every single one is a man, ostensibly, heterosexual, guy, because it's just someone whose case is uncomplicated by sexual orientation, or gender preference, or kind of gender identity, or gender altogether. And so, we still haven't figured out how to unravel that, and I don't think our legal system is any closer to it. It is striking, that I do think, and you said this too, I mean, this is not an issue just for Asian women. I mean, I was talking to someone about this shortly after Atlanta, and sort of, one of my colleagues at UCLA Law, Kimberly Crenshaw, is involved in the Say Her Name campaign, which has been lifting up, Black women who have been the victims of police violence, because their cases often get lost in the national narrative. And so it's this intersectional issue, and being lost at the margins, or the intersections, as you said, is very, very real, and certainly not specific to Asian Americans. So I've been struggling with, what are we going to do as a community to ensure that the victims in Atlanta, whose names most of us don't know, partially because some of the families have not wanted to center them, but still we know Vincent Chin's name, we know Jose Beleto, who was killed in Southern California, but do we know, will we know these Atlanta names if we even know them now, right? Renee, I also wanted to, come back to you to see if you want to add or expand on any thoughts around this intersection of, race and sex and gender, given your work.
Yeah, I mean, the direction that Jen and Helen have been going, it's really made me think a lot. I mean, what Helen was saying of, the story of how they made people look intersectionally at these incidents of violence, that's why Asian women need to be at the table, as lawyers, as, journalists, as scholars, as communicators, because we know our truth, and that's often not known at all. I mean, sometimes it's anecdotal, but lived experience is, really important. So we know our truth, and that's what people were, the argument Asian American women were making after the Atlanta shootings is, we know this to be our truth, and you've got to listen to it. And also the data. So what the other thing Helen was explaining is, you go from proposing that truth and investigating and then developing this data. But there's that tension always. And as a filmmaker, I'm always aware of that, between the story, the anecdotal, and also the data. That truth, that story, the anecdote of what we know to be true it's just been crucial in any advance that Asian Americans have made, because we've been so marginalized, because we've been so invisible. On the other hand, sometimes the data just kind of disproves it. I mean, very recently, we've seen all this anecdotal, like these viral videos of Black and brown assailants, particularly targeting Asian elders and a lot of Asian women. And so there's this narrative that's been online that, there's these Black and brown criminals. This is like, deja vu of the 1990s, that they're targeting Asians. Where if you look at Melissa Borcha's University of Michigan report that's just been out this past week, they looked at hate incidents, and it's like, I think almost 90% were white males, perpetrated by white males. But, there's that ideological battle, and part of that ideological battle is communicated through either the anecdote or the data. And so then I thought, as I was listening to them, I mean, as a filmmaker too, it's how are we going to change these perceptions of Asian women? I think they've started to change, and in large part because we have more of a presence. I mean, it's not great. And Nancy Wang Yuan has done this study with USC on Asian Americans just in general on screen. I thought things were getting great, but according to the study, no, it's like just really, really far behind. And I think a huge percentage, I want to say it was like 40% of Asians on screen are dead by the end of the show. I mean, so that gives you a sense of this idea of expendability. But there have been gains in terms of Asian American women of being much more, you know, forceful characters, largely because there are Asian Americans and Asian American women who have can be showrunners and directors and, you know, screenwriters and have the control the means of production. And that's come because of all this organizing over the years, not only organizing in the media space, but just every Asian American movement has touched upon the need for change in terms of cultural images and perceptions of Asian Americans. So, you know, I think, I mean, I have some hope. You know, one of the, it's probably bad to love this, but, you know, Mrs. Shea, the lady in San Francisco who got that board and like beat the shit out of that guy. I have her t-shirts. It's like very, there's like a, you know, it was like fucks, whatever, but it's great. I mean, I can't wait to wear it outside. And I was just thinking, listening to Jen, like, you know, if I ever form a senior citizen punk band like the Linda Lindas, I think I'll call it Moral Panic. I mean, let's just take back, you know, who we are and just push it in their face and, you know, just change like how people look at us as Asian women. And I think with younger generations, they are very much in your face and they are really changing it. And, you know, racist, sexist boy, like F you. I mean, and it didn't start with the young generation. Leela Lee, you know, angry little Asian girl. I mean, that must be from the early 2000s, right? Flipping the bird at everybody. So, so I think things will, I can't wait till things change.
Thanks, Renee. I can't wait to come to your Moral Panic band premiere. Jen, I think you wanted to chime in because you actually had some additional thoughts on the missing Asian women.
Yeah, I really liked this conversation about the missing Asian American women in the way that we talk about racism and hate crime and hate incidents. And I think that that's really insightful. I wanted to sort of broaden that and sort of go back to this question of intersectionality. You know, Kimberly Crenshaw presents intersectionality and talks about it as legal scholarship to think about the ways in which we don't think about the law in ways that reflect the complexities of identity. And so we're always talking about sort of like these hypothetical victims or hypothetical plaintiffs who lack sort of the multidimensional aspects of how people experience identity. And so intersectionality is really about sort of broadening the way that we think about the law and saying that, you know, the way that we think about reproductive law, reproductive justice law, and the way that we think about law as it comes to civil rights and racism, that's intermingled and intertwined when it comes to Black women who might be experiencing aspects of both of those things. And I think in a similar way, we can think about the ways that Asian American women have been largely absent in the way that we think about how Asian Americans experience the law, because I think that the way that we think about Asian American racial identity is fundamentally degendered. And so it sort of reflects sort of this de facto Asian American man, or because, you know, the man is sort of the default in the way that we think about Asian American racial identity. That's in the law, that's sort of more broadly politically and culturally too. Sort of the default is the Asian American guy. And so the experiences of the Asian American woman is completely removed from the ways that we think about what is even relevant to the Asian American community. And so when it comes to the law, we talk about Asian Americans and the ways in which we experience like hate crime law and that kind of thing. But why is it that we don't talk about Asian American issues for the legal community as also including, for example, reproductive justice law or reproductive law? You know, there's a lot of conversation in feminist circles about, you know, anti-abortion bills and how that's impacting women. A lot of those bills, as they're doing this state by state attempt to try and remove reproductive rights access, has targeted Asian American women using racism and racist rhetoric against Asian women as again, you know, speaking to this idea that of Asian American women as fundamentally amoral and corrupting influences, that we're more prone to wanting to abort our fetuses based on gender, for example. So this racist stereotype. Why isn't that something that we talk about for Asian Americans in the law? The reason we don't do that is because we don't think about the intersection the intersection of Asian American women's identity when it comes to reproductive law, and seeing that as an Asian American issue for the law. Similarly with domestic violence, we don't talk about, studies have shown that Asian American women experience domestic violence at alarming rates, and yet we don't think about the Asian American woman victim in domestic violence law, and we don't think about domestic violence law when it comes to Asian Americans in the law. And so one of the things that we can really do moving forward, I think, is just complicate what we think about when it comes to Asian Americans in the law, to include the many different ways and the many different intersections of identity that are encompassed by this larger Asian American sort of term.
Thank you, Jen. I think those are incredibly valid critiques and comments as somebody who's been working in kind of the legal advocacy world. I absolutely agree. I mean, I think, and this is probably true for other communities of color, but Asian American women have definitely kind of held up the burden of, addressing these issues if they get addressed at all, but they don't get addressed by the more mainstream Asian American groups. I mean, we do have a lot of issues we're dealing with as a community, but yeah, whether it's the example of the violence or, under healthcare, the reproductive justice piece, why don't these pieces get equal footing and center stage with some of the other issues that we rally around as a community? These are valid questions, and ones that I think, the Atlanta shooting and where we are at this moment gives us a chance to really press on that, right? And see if we can shift that conversation and framing within our larger Asian American community. One thing before, so I want to try to kind of follow your lead, Jen, in a second and go towards kind of more forward-looking, where we go from here. There was one clarifying question that I tried to clarify through chat. I want to make sure I clarified it correctly on Helen's behalf, but someone actually just wanted to clarify what was the significance of the dates, July 4th and December 7th. I think, Helen, you may have mentioned that in your comments, and I don't know if you just want to verbally clarify that. Oh, you're muted again.
Sorry, I'm trying to behave and make sure that I don't have any bad buzzing or whatever that comes on. And yes, I know you would think after a year and a half, you would get into the habit. But anyway, December 7th and July 4th are days of hyper-patriotism, America first. And who has been the historic enemy of American? It's people with an yellow or brown Asian face. And so these are days where, yes, violence toward Asian Americans have historically spiked at different times. I haven't paid attention to the actual dates now for a little while. And within this past year, we've been having daily spikes. So, but that's the significance of July 4th and December 7th. And I'm sure this year is going to just, what we've experienced is going to add a lot of other dates to it too. I would also think 9/11 is a date where, there are dates when I go out and about where I'm actually much more, aware of what's around me, because I know that these could be trigger dates for people who have violence, and racism on their minds.
Great, thank you for clarifying the importance and significance of those dates, and also including September 11th in that. So I want to turn towards kind of more forward-looking as we kind of enter the home stretch of the panel. So, we've spent the past hour examining how racialized violence against Asian Americans often has a distinct gender and or sex angle to it, even if we don't realize it, and also how there's been a longstanding failure to fully acknowledge how these intersections, affect which cases get championed, what issues, are prioritized. So we have that awareness now, and I want to take a step away from, the conversation around kind of the rising violence against Asian Americans, and kind of look at the broader context we're in at this moment, which is a global reckoning on racial injustice, global, but particularly here in the United States. And, as Helen mentioned, a key response from Asian Americans, for decades, for 4 decades, to racialized violence against members of our community has been to push to prosecute these attacks, as hate crimes. And I think it's really telling and interesting to understand the history of Vincent Chin, which we talked about at the beginning, because, it's fairly shocking to think that, less than 40 years ago, Asian Americans weren't considered fully protected by civil rights laws, and that it was an ongoing, evolving understanding that I think it took activists like Helen and others in Detroit to really kind of push across the finish line at that time to get Asian Americans kind of covered by the full protection of U.S. civil rights laws. As somebody who came out of the Asian American Civil Rights Movement, worked in a civil rights organization for many years, I mean, that was the de facto response when we saw, these violent cases of violence that had racial motivation. One of the first things, sometimes the only things that we did was to push for prosecution, to have it called a hate crime. And I think there's some validity to that in the sense that the reason that feels important is because we're so invisible, I think, within the legal system, and naming it legally gives some visibility, right, to the violence that members of our community feel. But now we're kind of in this moment, essentially the biggest uprising against racial injustice since the 1960s civil rights era. There's a significant grassroots movement led primarily by Black and Brown communities to reform and for some to dismantle, what is a current very unfair system of policing and criminal justice. So I raise all that to kind of, pull us back to the moment we're in, and then to turn to each of the three of you to kind of share, what your kind of vision or hope is for us, whether as Asian Americans specifically, or as people who care about racism and racist violence more generally, how do we respond to these two, colliding moments? And before I call on you to respond, I did want to make one comment, which is that, we took questions from the people who RSVP'd in advance. And a lot of questions were actually about how to be involved proactively in responding to violence, particularly as lawyers. Apollo's a legal organization. A lot of the audience is lawyers or in the legal community. So what we're going to do is drop some suggestions into the chat. But I wanted to just make one comment that we're not, because our three speakers, if you haven't already realized it, although Jen is quite knowledgeable about the legal system and the law, we are not focused on necessarily the law as the solution here on this panel. And quite honestly, as someone who has been a lawyer for many years, the legal system often fails us in terms of, adequate solutions. But we will drop some things into the chat in terms of lawyers who want to do things. I will make one last point, which is that a lot of people have asked about doing pro bono work. And from speaking to fellow civil rights lawyers in the Asian American community, if that is what you want to do there, and I think Charles from AAPI, who's helping with the chat, will tell you how to get involved with AAPI. There are opportunities to do that, but I would also encourage lawyers to think about, what can you do that's not about staying within the legal system, and looking broader to the social and political ways we need to address hate violence against us right now. Lawyers have told me repeatedly that there are a lot more people wanting to do pro bono legal work than there are actually legal cases to act on. And so we need you to think more broadly about what you can do personally. So that's my message to the lawyers in the audience. But with that, I wanted to kind of go back to the question about, the vision that Helen, Jen, and Renee have on what we should be doing to respond to these kind of the collision of the anti-Asian violence that's been happening, the issues we've unpacked around gender and race and sex, and also this moment that we're in. And I'm going to start with Helen and then go to Jen and then to Renee.
Okay. What can we be thinking about in the future and this moment that we're in? That's a very, very big question. And there are no easy answers to it, of course. When I think of where we're at today, I also, I don't think the invisibility that Asian Americans had, in the 1980s with the Vincent Chin case, when we had to answer questions like, well, where did you people come from? Really? Asian Americans, you're here. And oh my God, there was a crime, really? And you care about it. I mean, that was really the response that we often got, and had to educate people and do Asian Americans 101 all the time. And sad to say, 39 years later, I don't think we've progressed that much in there. Instead of a few million Asian Americans in the 1980s, now we have 22 plus million Asian Americans. We have a legal field with an organization for APA Women Lawyers Association. I mean, that's huge. Those are really big differences. Renee talked about the changes that are going on in the media industry, and the voices that are out there of activists like Jen who are bringing up these issues, and that's different. That's progress. But in terms of how we're seen in the rest of America, I mean, I think doing Asian Americans 101, I feel like I've been doing that for another 40 years, and it has to be done. I'm not, I'm not, saying that, how awful, I don't want to do this anymore, because it has to be done. And to the extent that anybody's willing to listen and learn and maybe deconstruct, decolonize the bullshit that we've all been fed since we were babies, if they're willing to listen, great, we have to do it. But so in the going forward, I think we still have the invisibility. We're talking about the double jeopardy or triple jeopardy that Asian American women, that, people who are in the intersections face. And that is double, triple invisibility. And so, so in talking about things like dismantling, I actually talk about demilitarizing, because I do feel that we've seen patterns of history where, great movements have happened. And when we tear down, what are we going to put in place? I think about our communities. Protection is a part of law and criminal justice. And unless we're going to say we're going to get rid of all of that, what are we going to put in place for our communities? And it's not just talking about Asian Americans and this image that Renee talked about, that it's all, Black and brown people who are attacking Asian Americans. That's part of what's being perpetuated now to divide us. That, and Asian Americans, we know we have been experiencing this anti-Asian hate from, the get-go. Yeah, I mean, way before this pandemic, but in this current tsunami, it began in December 2019, as soon as COVID was mentioned. And it's really a shame. It's, to me, outrageous that it really took a mass killing in Atlanta and another mass killing in Indianapolis of Asian Americans for people to say, oh, wow, you Asian Americans, you're really experiencing, something we should pay attention to. And it had already been going on for months. So to me, these are all signs of the invisibility that continues. So that invisibility also involves other communities that we should be uniting with, and we have to deconstruct the divisions that have been enforced on our communities for these past few decades. I think that the barriers to multiracial and multi-everything unity are higher today than they were back in the 1980s. And during the Vincent Chin case, it was assumed that Asian Americans, could unite with other communities of color around, the killing of Vincent Chin. Yeah, we had to build that unity, but there wasn't a question of, well, are you Asians, really, aren't you mostly white and want to oppress our community? That wasn't there to the degree that we have today. And I think for activists on the ground, that's a something that has to be addressed. And I think if I were, a Black American active in the a BLM, figuring out how to join with the Asian American community would not be high on my list. And I think that's something we have to address as well. So what do I think in the future? I emphasize accountability. I've had discussions with dismantle folks, and I understand where they're coming from, and I don't disagree with where they're coming from. But when I say, what about accountability? What about insisting that the laws we have, like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, should be applied with, equal justice and equity? I have had responses like, what do you mean accountability? And I'm like, what do you mean? What do I mean accountability? Let's apply the law the way it has been intended to be to all, the full humanity of all people. And so I think in this place that we are today, that's what I would like to see. And I would, and I'm just so heartened and encouraged to know that there are Asian American women speaking up all the time because we have a higher bar. When we're seen as invisible and silenced by things like the racist model minority myth or always the foreign invader, those things silence us. People don't hear us. And so we have to speak even louder and cross a higher bar. So, so I'm really heartened that this group exists. And these are the things that we have to address. You know, we won't solve everything, but you know what? If we do nothing, we are part of the problem and supporting the status quo. So doing something to create change is really going to take all of us.
Thank you, Helen. And I want to turn then to Jen and to Renee, and if you keep your comments to about 5 minutes each.
Sure. Yeah, and I really appreciate the question and how do we move forward, right? Like Helen, I really think we need to focus on solidarity and building connections. You know, Helen has really talked a lot about interracial solidarity work and the importance of doing that. Like Helen, I really believe that that's key to what we need to do, especially, you know, if we're going to be pursuing potentially anti-carceral solutions. I think one thing we need to be doing is making connections within our local communities between Asian Americans and other communities of color to learn exactly what kinds of solutions we're proposing and how that's going to impact not just our safety, but the safety of other communities. And there's a lot of shared experiences there when it comes to experiences with police violence and state violence, that we can find common cause across different communities, across different races. And so I think we really need to be, as Helen said, having Asian American 101 in conversation with other groups and learning as much as teaching about who we are and what our experiences are. Within that also, we also need to be doing better work about creating connections within the Asian American community. You know, we've been talking a lot about the recent rise in anti-Asian violence, but some Asian Americans haven't experienced this as a recent rise. You know, if we're looking at brown Asian Americans, for example, since 9/11, they've been experiencing violence targeting South Asian Americans under the context of Islamophobia. And so there's a connection there between Muslim Americans and South Asian Americans and how they've been experiencing racial violence for years. And we need to be drawing connections between you know, the Atlanta shooting and yes, the comment that just came up with the FedEx shooting just a month later that targeted 4 Sikh Americans and South Asian Americans. We don't yet know exactly the motives, but we can certainly speculate in much the same way that we've speculated about the Atlanta shootings, that race and gender are inexplicably inextricably connected to that shooting as well. And I appreciate the commenter holding us accountable and saying we need to absolutely mention that. And so we need to be drawing connections within our Asian American community to try and find ways that we can come together as a community and find common cause even within our own experiences that diverge so sharply from one another and still organize around the things that we share in common. And so looking forward, I really believe that just having more focus on trying to find and build those bridges, learning the lessons from our sort of movement leaders in the past, that really, I think the way forward, the way towards liberation is about educating one another, educating ourselves, learning from ourselves, holding others accountable, holding ourselves accountable, and just trying to find ways that we can organize and unite together.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one thing that was important in terms of the Vincent Chin case that Helen mentioned is Asian Americans should be equally represented by civil rights law. But I think the law and the justice system does matter. Like what are the solutions? You know, how do we address anti-Asian violence or racial violence as a whole? And you know, in the 1980s, with that upsurge of anti-Asian violence, we really did see enhanced penalties as being the solution. And we also saw perpetrators as being white. Now that started to change. The whole narrative started to change in the 1990s with the LA uprising, and then, you know, a lot of conflict with Black and brown communities. And then of course into today, I talked about like this perception that's fed by viral videos that they're Black and brown, particularly Black perpetrators committing violence towards Asians. And so there, in an interesting way, you have this bipartisan decision immediately after Atlanta that yes, we will have these hate crime data, which is good, but it opens the door to enhance penalties. And so in terms of looking at things intersectionally, it's also class and race, and I mentioned the data as being it's even though anti-Asian hate incidents are overwhelmingly committed by white perpetrators. I was in another talk recently, and somebody was saying that actually hate crime penalties have been disproportionately directed towards people of color, defendants of color lately. So it was really interesting in the shift in this perception that it was white perpetrators, and now it's perpetrators of color, and there's more of this bipartisan kind of openness to more policing and more and harsher kinds of penalties. And when I talk about the intersection of like class, I mean even in New York after that there was a 60-ish Filipina woman who was beaten horrifically in front on West 43rd Street. And I read this article in the New York Times, even the NYPD, the spokesman was saying, well, these incidents in New York tend to be people who are, he didn't use the word impacted poverty, but that's what he was describing. People who are unhoused and they had serious mental health issues. That perpetrator, had killed his mother and he was out on parole. So to me, the long-term solutions are, mental health services, housing, social services, as well as anti-racist kind of education and organizing. But of course, it's complicated because short-term solutions are, people want to be protected. So how do you explain, like, how do I tell my mother, okay, you have to look at things in a much larger kind of intersectional way. She just wants to know, can I go out on the street and be safe? So I think it's very complicated. One last thing I'd like to say is just a personal kind of experience of this year as an older Asian woman and hearing, and I was thinking, because I read the statistic that so many Asian women were being targeted. And I thought in this past year, I've been all over Los Angeles because I was filming the Black Lives Matter protests, which was almost, exclusively young people, Black, white, brown, Asian, indigenous. And I always felt safe. And I was always out on the street at night. Sometimes I'd be looking for the march, and they know who I was, but I'd see like a young person with a t-shirt, political t-shirt. And I thought, oh my God, now I'm going to be safe, because I knew these young people were there to defend me. They were there for justice. They were there to protect people like me, in a larger way as well as in a very personal way. So even though, and again, it's the data. It's been, studies have shown that, these protests have been peaceful, but, all the protesters have been demonized as being violent. But they're the ones, those young organizers are the ones who are rethinking these solutions. They're the ones who are really keeping us safe.
Thank you all. And Renee, I'm sorry if I missed this. Did you want to just mention, we put up the links to the May 19th project? Okay. Do you just want to, 2 sentences on that?
Yeah, so as a result of this kind of narrative of anti-Blackness, Jeff Chang and I mounted this crazy, we produced 14 videos in like 6 weeks time. It's called the May 19th Project, #SolidarityIs, and every day from May 19th through June 1st, we're rolling out videos, short videos on social media platforms on the legacy of AAPI solidarity with other communities. And some of them are legal things, so I hope you watch and post and share.
Thank you for doing the videos and also sharing that with us. And then we are at the end of our time, so I want to say thank you to Renee, to Jen, and to Helen for making time in a very busy month to be with us. You've given a lot us a lot to think about and ways forward when it comes to structural responses, I think, to violence against Asian Americans. I feel like a lot of our focus sometimes is on the short-term individual punishment of specific perpetrators. That's what the criminal justice system has, zeroes in on. But I think this closing conversation really makes us think more broadly about how do we fix the problem more structurally going forward. And I hope all of us can move forward with a better understanding of the intersections of race and gender and sex, and also keep in mind those who fall through the margins, whether it's the 2/3 of reported incidents to stop AAPI hate, whether it's the 4 Sikh South Asian women in Indianapolis or the 6 East Asian American women in Atlanta, or some of the cases Helen mentioned. Our hope is that we can better center these voices as a community going forward. So thank you to our wonderful panelists again, and thank you to AAPI for hosting this and all of you for being here. And please support AAPI so they can continue to offer wonderful programs like today's panel. Thank you all.